It is wonderful to be entrusted with the government of this country, this great country, once again. And I want to say this to you. The greater the trust, the greater the duty upon us to be worthy of that trust. And we will indeed endeavour to serve the people of these islands in the future as we have in the past.
By the time we came to the 87 election, the miners' strike, of course, was in people's memories, but so many other issues had begun to come in again. There was more economic problems to deal with. She'd been in office then, obviously a long time. And I think people then sort of had to look at her in the round when they made their decision in 87. And of course she got a lower majority. So that, if you like, the sort of doubts as to whether she's always going to be right, we're beginning to seep in, I think.
And could you clear up what the position is about your own future? Do you intend to fight the next election?
Look, we've just won this one. We've won it very well. It will be 4 or 5 years to the next election. No one can predict precisely what will happen during that time. Let us get on with the programme that we were elected to introduce. There's a great deal of work to do.
Margaret, this time you've just gone too far.
You've turned into a dictator.
You don't listen to anyone.
You're insane, Margaret. You've lost all reason.
We've had enough. You're finished.
Yeah.
All right. Has everyone got their lines?
Yes, I got mine.
Right, we're all ready.
Right. No pulling out now.
No.
We've gone this far. There's no backing down.
Right.
Morning!
Go on.
Margaret!
Yes, Geoffrey.
Good morning.
Morning, sir.
Right, stand up, sit down, stick your finger up your nose, and make a noise like a chicken.
Spineless insects. I despise you.
Oh, thank you, sir.
Towards the end of her time, she did become noticeably more authoritarian. Where you did really begin to notice it was post-87, when in a way she got carried away with her own power. The feeling by then that nothing really happened unless she did it and forced it through, and everybody had to do what she said.
Mrs. Thatcher appeared on the steps of Downing Street with her husband this morning, breaking off preparations for tomorrow's visit to Kenya and Nigeria in order to officially mark her record 8 years and 244 days in number 10. That reign began in May 1979 with much the same wave. Today she said the time had gone quickly. There was still much to do.
We have achieved quite a lot. When I went through that door, Britain was known for suffering from the British disease. Now we're known for having the British cure, and people come to us, a newly confident country, to see exactly how we've done it.
One of the few critical notes has come from Sir John Knott, her former Defence Secretary, who reportedly told the BBC's Panorama that Mrs. Thatcher sometimes had to be restrained from going over the top.
I have no idea what John Knott has said. John Knott was a very vivid, vital, interesting member of our cabinet, full of new ideas.
He said your leadership was over the top, Mrs. Thatcher.
Tonight, Sir John told ITN Mrs. Thatcher had been an outstanding Prime Minister, her achievements immense.
She'd out-survived all the ministers who'd been with her at the very beginning, almost all the senior advisors and civil servants. So towards the end, she did become, pretty difficult to certainly control. No one could control her.
The very interesting thing about successful politicians, or perhaps anyone who's successful in public life, is that what makes them really successful at the beginning is also what, to some extent, later on brings them down. And her great success, of course, was not listening to those silly ministers and, doing what she wanted to do and driving things ahead and being sort of very, very forceful. So eventually, of course, that's perhaps what did for her.
I remember talking after she'd left office, for example, some years after she'd left office, to Kenneth Clarke, who'd served in her cabinet. And he said it was absolutely astonishing. We would have cabinet committee meetings and we would all have a fair idea of what was being discussed and what decisions appear to have been reached. And the following morning, the minutes of the cabinet committee would come round and there were completely different conclusions. Of course, we'd had a foreshadowing of that in the Westland affair with Michael Heseltine. That was his complaint, that business wasn't being conducted properly.
In the early days, before going to a European summit meeting, for example, she would have a gathering of all the ministers whose agenda was likely to be discussed, and senior civil servants, and her briefing would be thorough and comprehensive. In the later days, on issues that were familiar, she was almost unwilling to discuss at all. That's why Nigel Lawson and I fell out with her, and she wouldn't have a meeting with us before the Madrid summit. It had become more distant and less easy to handle.
There was a very, very serious difference there. Basically, it was the argument that ran through the whole of her time as Prime Minister as to the attitudes to Europe. Lawson increasingly felt that we had to get close to something like monetary union. And her particular hatred of what he was doing was that he was trying to get the pound to shadow the Deutschmark, which she thought was highly suspicious. And so Alan Walters, who she appointed as her private financial affairs economic advisor, was telling her that. He was telling her on a daily basis that what Lawson was doing was wrong. And in the end, of course, Lawson could take no more of it and went. And Prime Minister who loses a Chancellor is obviously in some trouble.
Nigel's position, as I said to him, is unassailable. He was a very strong
It isn't now, is it? He's gone.
That is his choice. I tried to persuade him to stay. I couldn't believe that he would go when he's been such a strong Chancellor, and his position was unassailable.
Do you deny that Nigel would have stayed if you had sacked Professor Alan Walters?
I don't know.
Of course, but that's a terrible admission, Prime Minister.
I don't know, of course I don't
know. You could have kept your Chancellor, possibly, if you had sacked your part-time advisor.
I wanted to keep my Chancellor in any event, because he was very good, his position was unassailable, and let's face it, Brian, he was Chancellor.
For the Prime Minister, business as usual meant church as usual near Chequers today. She'll have been aware that her interview this afternoon would be watched anxiously by Tory backbenchers, many of whom have called for a softer leadership style following the resignation crisis.
I'm staying my own sweet, reasonable self, founded on very strong convictions.
Prime Minister, I must stop you there.
No, you must not.
Thank you very much indeed.
Strong leadership will continue.
It simply has to be a change of style, and if she's not prepared to change her style, then I think we've got to face up to the position of whether we can continue with her as leader.
It was part of this mix that was all going on. The idea of the poll tax going to be rolled out, the arguments over Europe, the approaching recession. There were signs, of course, that we were going to go back into another recession. It was just all beginning to go wrong.
Mr. Baker confirmed that the backbenchers had asked the Prime Minister to get her act together.
Yes, they certainly said that, and I think that that's very important. The government has appeared from time to time to be disunited. It's very important that we present the whole of government policy as a united series of policies drawn from collective responsibility.
And when told, please get your act together, what was the Prime Minister's reply?
Well, the Prime Minister listened a great deal, which is, again, very important. It was the opportunity to do that. If you're asking her to stop being a strong leader, then I don't think that would be the position.
And word came from the Thatcher camp later that there would be no softening of the Prime Minister's style, that she was, quote, the true guardian of the government's purpose.
Among Conservative MPs today, divided opinions about what's happened. One camp thinks that Mrs. Thatcher has emerged the stronger from all that's happened, now that the simmering row between her and Nigel Lawson has come to an end. But another camp feels that she has been seriously weakened. Past her sell-by date is the way one backbench MP put it today. And there's also continuing talk about making a formal challenge to her leadership.
They thought their winner had become a loser. And at that time, the election of the leader of the party was entirely in the gift of members of Parliament. And they were fearful that they, as individuals, would not be re-elected, or stood a better chance of being re-elected with a new leader. Also, after you've been in power for a number of years, people, well, You've promoted those who are going to be promoted, and those who haven't been promoted know they never will be. So the leader has no longer got any patronage to offer. So you can't say, I'm going to look after you, because you haven't looked after them so far. So you've got these 300 or 400 people milling around Westminster, knowing they're not going to be advanced any further, because they haven't been so far, thinking they're going to lose their seats. The
charge is finally set to say precisely what the increase would have been in domestic rates had that taken the place of the community charge.
People are not going to pay what might have been. They're going to pay the much higher charges inflicted upon them by her and her government.
In a way, I think that was her biggest mistake, because she didn't listen to people. People were beginning to tell her, you can't go with the poll tax. But by then she was getting impatient, and she decided to ignore people's advice. And then she really did go ahead. And look what happened as a result.